Hello, everybody. It's nice that we have such a great turnout today. So I'm Dr. Veronica Fleury. I'm an assistant professor in special education, and I also serve as the coordinator for our autism teacher licensure program. And so I'm going to share with you all the second main project that came out of this global signature program. Right. So for this study, our immediate objective was to gain a better understanding of how different variables or factors influences people's perceptions of various treatments that have historically or currently being used to treat autism. And for this study, we particularly were looking at the variables of evidence, so the evidentiary basis of the treatment, as well as the credibility of the source who's recommending the treatment. All right, and from this study, our long-term goal is that we would be able to use this knowledge to better inform how we as a community talk about evidence-based practices, so that we could talk about it in a way that the public and practitioners and families are more likely to accept the evidence and refute the treatments that are less efficacious or not efficacious. Okay. So in order to do this, we went to the state fair. We actually have a really great opportunity here at the University of Minnesota that the U of M has a dedicated research building that they rent out at the state fair, where people can come and take part in various research projects. And these are projects that are being conducted by folks across the university. So we have a range of studies being represented in the Driven to Discover building at the state fair. So I'm assuming most of you have been at the state fair, or at least have heard about it. So most of you guys are probably familiar with just the sheer enormity of it. So this is just one image taken on one day, right? It's a big event that people come from all over the state and even neighboring states to attend. And we wanted to take advantage of this opportunity because it would provide us with a pretty rare opportunity where we would have access to the general public, right? But before I go on, I do want to acknowledge that this was truly a collaborative project. So not only amongst us faculty in terms of its inception, but also in the actual realization of it, right? So we had, in order to do this, we were at the state fair for, I want to say, 5 full days. And there was no way that we were going to be at the state fair 5 days collecting data. So we sent out a request to our students in our department to help us collect data. And we had over 13 students who volunteered part of their summers to just come in and help us collect this data. And I see a lot of these students in the room. So we sincerely thank you for your help with this project, because it really would not have gotten done without your support, right? So I mentioned that one of the appeals of going to the state fair was that we could have access to people from all walks of life, right? That we could have access to the general population, which is something that we typically aren't able to do through our typical recruitment methods, right? And this was somewhat the case. So we had a total of 379 usable surveys. We actually had over 600 people take the survey, but their data was not usable because we embedded attention checks throughout the survey. And if they failed an attention check, so meaning they weren't really reading, they were just answering, they were kicked out. But out of the 600 plus surveys, 379 of the participants successfully passed all the attention checks and completed the entire survey. All right? We had a nice full range of participants represented. So in order to participate, you had to be at least 18 years old. So we did have the full range from age 18 to age 81, okay? Predominantly female, 65%, right? And 66% reported actually knowing someone with autism in their immediate social circle, all right? So even though we were in a public venue, which would give us access to the general public, the types of people who would come to a University of Minnesota research building, let alone take a research study, is still a select group of people, right? So the majority of our participants were white, 96%, and we had a very highly educated sample. So I believe all but 3 had a high school diploma, 67% had a college degree or higher, right? So again, we have a really educated sample here. Right. So What we did for this study is we just took a portion of the survey that Dr. that Dr. Travers just presented. So we essentially made a study based on a 2x2 factorial design, right? So we had two main factors that we were looking at: treatment status, right, which had two levels, evidence-based and non-evidence-based or FAD treatments. The second factor that we were interested in was source credibility, and that also had two levels, right? So incredible sources versus credible sources, right? And this was based on the literature, right? That we know that based on the literature that some people and some sources are deemed to be more credible than others. Okay? So for our study, our credible sources, let's start with uncredible. Our incredible sources were celebrities, magazines, blogs, and TV shows. Right? Our credible sources were professors, physicians, information from a textbook, or information from a peer-reviewed journal article. Right? So again, we have this 2x2 factorial design, two main factors, treatment status and source credibility, and each of those factors have two levels that we're looking at. Right? And so everybody would read a description they would read all 8 descriptions of all of these strategies, okay? And then they would answer some questions. So here's an example of what a participant would see. So this is an example of the description of pressure-weighted vests. So this is a non-evidence-based practice that's commonly used in schools and homes with kids with autism. And you see that in this version, it's a physician who's endorsing its use. We also had an alternate form or alternate survey in which they see the same information, but it's being endorsed by an incredible source. So I believe it was a celebrity in the alternate version, okay? Right. So participants were randomly assigned to the survey choice, right? And then after each scenario or each description, we asked the same series of questions. So, are you familiar with the treatment? And this was a simple dichotomous yes, no. I've heard of this, right? And then we asked them to indicate the extent or the degree to which they find that treatment they just read about credible as a practice for individuals with autism. And then we asked, okay, based on what you've read, right, and your knowledge, would you recommend this practice for individuals with autism? So this last question is really getting more at intentionality, right? Sure, you may believe it, but would you actually do something about that, right? So here's what we found. So similar to what Dr. Travers just presented, we did find that overall, people are more familiar. Remember, this was just a simple yes-no response. People are more familiar with the FAD treatments than they are our evidence-based treatments. Okay. Right, in terms of credibility, so this was their responses to the question, to what extent do you find this practice credible? Right, and there was a rating scale from 1, like highly incredible, to 5, extremely credible. Okay, and I apologize for not having my y-axis labeled. But all right, so we do find an overall effect in which people generally found evidence-based practices to be more credible than non-evidence-based practices, right? Which is a good thing. Right? We also found an overall main effect for credibility source, such that information coming from a credible source is more credible than information coming from an incredible source. Okay? So we have these two overall main effects, but then when you look at the interaction between credibility and evidence, it is not significant. So, in other words, evidence-based practices being promoted by credible sources their responses do not significantly differ from evidence-based practices being promoted by an incredible source, right? And the same is true for non-evidence-based practices, okay? Now, in terms of their likelihood to recommend, again, they could respond on a scale from 1 to 5. 1, strongly not likely to recommend, and 5, extremely likely to recommend. And we see a similar pattern of findings, right? An overall main effect for evidence-based practices being more favorably viewed or more likely to be recommended compared to non-evidence-based practices, right? Credible sources receiving higher recommendation ratings than those coming from incredible sources. But again, we don't see an interaction, right? The interaction effect is not significant, meaning that people seem to be attending more to just the evidentiary basis and not including both evidence as well as credibility in their evaluations of the treatment. Yeah? Okay. Right. So because we were at the state fair and because we had a higher than expected response, we actually had an opportunity to introduce another slight manipulation to our study. So we got another study out of our state fair time. And in this study, we decided to introduce another manipulation, right? So it went from a 2x2 factorial design to a 2x2x2. Okay. So the factor that we introduced was a manipulation in which we said, hey, pay attention to who is promoting this treatment, right? So essentially everything remained the same, right? The survey was the same, but when we were going through the informed consent with the participants, at the end, we told them, okay, you're going to be reading about a lot of different treatments. And you'll notice that some sources are more credible than other sources, right? And then we gave them an example. So for instance, if you are wanting to find out about information about chemistry, you're more likely to trust a chemist than you would a clown, right? And we said, please pay attention to the credibility of the sources of information as you take this survey. Right? So it was just a simple added direction of pay attention. There are sources there who are telling you things. Okay? But again, the actual survey, all the descriptions remain the same. The material did not change other than our verbal direction at the start of the study. Right? So here's what we get. So this is data showing credibility versus condition. So the no manipulation was our first study. The manipulation condition is our second study, right? And we do have a main overall effect of credibility source, again, with credibility, right, receiving higher favorable credibility ratings than those from incredible sources, right? And in general, in the no manipulation condition, their responses were higher than in the manipulation condition. But we have a significant interaction here. Right? So although we do have this overall effect of a main effect of credibility, right? It is qualified by the condition, right? So we see that in the manipulation condition, when people are reading text from a non-credible source, they have lower credibility ratings for that, right? And credibility ratings from credible sources go up. Right? Yeah? Okay. So let's see what that looks like in terms of the evidence, right? So we had three factors that we were looking at. Evidence, the evidentiary basis, right? Source credibility, as well as the manipulation, right? And we have some significant findings here, some in the directions that we expect and some in the directions that we do not expect, right? So evidence-based practices presented by credible sources, their perceptions or their credibility ratings are not significantly different. It didn't matter if we told them, pay attention, okay? But we do see that the credibility ratings are lower in the manipulation condition when evidence-based practices are being promoted by incredible sources. Right? And we see that same effect here too, that non-evidence-based practices, so those fad treatments, when presented by an incredible source, goes down when we tell them to pay attention to who's saying it, right? But we had this unanticipated overcorrection effect here, right? Where all of a sudden now, non-evidence-based practices, those fad treatments, if they're presented by a credible source, gain credibility, okay? We also wanted to see if this pattern held for their likelihood to recommend this practice. Okay? So here you do see that in general, credible sources again are more likely to be recommended than those incredible sources. All right? And there is also a main effect of the manipulation condition. But what's important here is that you do see this interaction, that during the manipulation condition, the credit or the recommendation ratings from non-credible sources goes down. Okay? It doesn't affect information coming from credible sources. All right. All right, here's what it looks like by evidence-based practice when we take into account the evidence basis of it. All right, so no differences here in terms of evidence-based practices being promoted by credible people. Right? The manipulation condition did not impact that, nor did it impact non-evidence-based practices being promoted by a credible source. Right? But we do see that when incredible sources are promoting evidence-based practices, it goes down, right? It's less favorable. And same with incredible sources presenting non-evidence-based practices, right? So, in summary, because that was kind of a lot of data thrown at you, and a lot of numbers, the public seems to be more familiar with these fad treatments than evidence-based practices, right? Participants initially do not seem to take into account both source credibility as well as evidentiary basis when they are developing their evaluations about a treatment. But our manipulation instructions to specifically attend to that source credibility did have the intended effect for the most part, that information provided by incredible sources were less likely to be deemed as credible as well as less likely to be recommended. All right. But when we do look at kind of the overall numbers, even though a lot of these findings are statistically significant, in our field, we all know that statistical significance doesn't necessarily equate to social significance. All right, so for instance, when I'm looking at this data, it's great that people's evaluations become lower when incredible sources are providing that information, but the average recommendation rating is still, between 2.5 and 3, right? Which means kind of, sure, it's not great, but maybe I would recommend it. Right? What we would like to see is that when people are presented with a fad treatment that does not have any evidence to support it, being promoted by someone who is an incredible source, we need to get this bar down here, right? That we are not recommending practices that don't have an evidentiary basis and are being promoted by people who are incredible sources, right? So again, that difference is statistically significant, but we really need to strive for social significance, right? If we're actually going to make a difference in people's real practices. Yeah? All right, so I'm going to stop there. So we have some time for Dr. Moose to help us with our discussion, facilitate our discussion. Thank you.